All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Welcome to panel 3 on solutions. Assuming intellectual diversity is something that we should care about and that there's a lack of it, what can we do about it? This panel will examine solutions to promote intellectual diversity. And our moderator for this panel is Stephen Calabresi, so I'll go ahead and read Professor Calabresi's biography. Stephen Calabresi is the class of 1940 professor of law at Northwestern School of Law. He received his undergraduate degree from Yale University and his JD from Yale Law School before going on to clerk for Justice Antonin Scalia on the U.S. Supreme Court. He is the chairman of the board of the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies. So Professor Calabresi, thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be at this symposium today, and I want to really express gratitude to the Harvard Federalist Society for organizing it. I think this is a terrific idea. I can't resist beginning with one short story, which is a story about a number of Puritans at the end of the 17th century who became very concerned about teaching at Harvard College. There was a general fear that many unorthodox views were being taught in the classroom, that heresy had crept into some of the lectures, and even fears of secularization. The remedy or solution that was arrived at to this problem was that these Puritans formed a new college, Yale College, in New Haven, Connecticut, and Yale was founded basically to counter the deviationist trend at Harvard. Harvard's motto, of course, is veritas, meaning truth, so Yale adopted as its motto, lux et veritas, light and truth. So I don't know what conclusions one can draw permanently from that about solutions to problems of lack of intellectual diversity or incorrectness of teaching, but I think it seems to me worth contemplating. We have on our panel today 4 very distinguished faculty members, and I want to just briefly say something about them in the order in which they're going to speak. Our first speaker will be George Dent. George is a professor of law at Case Western Reserve School of Law. He writes on law and religion and also on business associations and has a JD and BA from Columbia. We will then hear from Robbie George. Robbie is the McCormick Chair in Jurisprudence at Princeton University and visiting at Harvard Law School this year. While at Princeton, he became the founding director of the James Madison program. Robbie has also served on the President's Council on Bioethics and is a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He's the author of numerous books and articles. We will hear then from Professor Jeannie Suk, who is a professor of law here at Harvard Law School. Professor Suk teaches criminal law and procedure, family law, and the law of art, fashion, and performing arts. Professor Suk clerked for Justice David Souter on the Supreme Court and for Judge Harry Edwards on the D.C. Circuit, and has written a book and numerous articles in, among other places, the Yale Law Journal, the Stanford Law Review, and the Columbia Law Review. Finally, we will hear from Paul Campos, who is a professor of law at the University of Colorado Law School. Professor Campos teaches constitutional law, legal philosophy, legal process, and property. So let's begin with Professor Dent. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I first want to thank the Federalist Society, and in particular to point out, since this is a conference on intellectual diversity, how much diversity there always is on Federalist Society programs. By contrast with some other organizations in the law school world. A couple of the earlier speakers said that diversity within particular law schools wasn't terribly important, but that diversity across law schools is important. So I want to begin by talking about the Association of American Law Schools. which has a unique position in higher education. It is a membership organization of law schools, and basically to be a respectable law school, you have to be a member of the AALS, and yet it is also an organization that runs programs by faculty members. And again, this is a position that is unique in higher education. And by comparison with the Federalist Society programs, the AALS is not concerned at all about intellectual diversity, at least in areas that have any political concern whatsoever. And an example is an all-day program that the AALS ran a few years ago after the decisions in the Gratz and Grutter cases about the future of racial preferences, in which there were a grand total of 25 speakers, all of whom were in favor of racial preferences. Not one was opposed. And I raised a question with them. I said, if you're especially in a program about dealing with diversity, don't you think you should have a little diversity? And their answer was no. And Jim Lindgren raised the issue with him, and he was, I guess they cut him off when he started to complain. So given his behavior, it might surprise you to learn that the AALS bylaws say that it expects member schools to value, inter alia, diversity of viewpoints. So in theory, this is not a question of getting them to change their principles, but simply of getting them to live up to their own professed principles. And with that in mind, I have been pulling the laboring oar in a project with a small group that includes Jim Lindgren, Randy Barnett, Amy Wax, and Elizabeth Foley, to try to talk with Susan Prager, the executive director of the AALS. We arranged a meeting with her and the then president, Lauren Robel, to point out the lack of intellectual diversity on many, many programs run by the AALS, and they seemed to admit that what we were saying was true and that it was a problem. But since then, we've had a great deal of difficulty in getting them to continue the dialogue. I'll make calls and they don't respond for months. I hate to accuse anyone of bad faith, but let's say if they were deliberately trying to stall us, this is the way they would be behaving. One specific issue we raised was access to the database of the AALS's faculty appointments register. There was a lot of talk earlier today about statistics. What is the political profile of faculty members? And some people have complained that just saying Republican and Democrat doesn't get you very far. Well, a couple of grad students at Berkeley did a study based on what data they could get. And they found that of politically identifiable new law school hires, liberals outnumbered conservatives by 7-1, and that in more politically sensitive areas like constitutional law, it was 11-1. But as they admitted, the data on which they were performing their study were not comprehensive. And the real gold mine source of data was the AALS's FAR database. However, they've refused to make that available. Their justification being that they have promised confidentiality to people who submit resumes for this purpose. We have pointed out, and Jim, who knows much more about empirical research than I do, have pointed out that those concerns can be easily addressed, but nonetheless they've continued to refuse to make that information available. So what to do? Sounding a theme I'll talk a little bit more about later, I think one reason we're not getting any more response from the ALS is simply that it's just a group of 5 people and they're not terribly concerned. One possibility would be to get more people involved. If there are a couple of hundred people prodding them, maybe they would show more concern. The Federalist Society has an ABA watch committee that monitors what's going on in the American Bar Association and publicizing what goes on. Maybe it would be a good idea for the Federalist Society also to have an AALS watch committee that would do the same kind of thing, publicize the kinds of things that go on. The example I gave about the program, I could give hundreds of examples of one-sided programs at the AALS. Maybe if there were a little more publicity about this and more complaints, the AALS would change its ways. The second thing I want to talk about is activity at your own school. Like the AALS statement on diversity, if you look at your own school's statement on diversity, and I'm sure it has one, you'll find in many cases, almost always, there is a reference to diversity of viewpoints or intellectual diversity, something along those lines. And indeed, in some cases, you will find that other forms of diversity are supposed to be only described as instrumental to the diversity of ideas. That is, we care about diversity of race because it contributes to diversity of ideas. Well, here again at my own school, I'm involved in an effort. We've been in touch with the vice president for vice president for diversity. And we've arranged a meeting with her for next week to discuss a number of things, one of which is that her office runs a speaker series on diversity in which all the speakers are from the left. So their diversity series has no diversity. I don't know what kind of response we're going to get, but again, if you look at your own school, I'm sure you will find that you have similar wording in your school statements of diversity, and that in fact they do not live up to it with respect to intellectual diversity. One thing that could be helpful is to find allies in other divisions of your university and among trustees and alumni. And regarding the latter, I encourage you to get familiar with and even to contact the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, better known by its acronym ACTA. Its president, Ann Neal, is an alumna of this law school. She's bright and dynamic, and what she will do in some cases, if she can, is if you call her, she'll find out if they have a sympathetic trustee or some sympathetic alumni from your school, and if there is someone, perhaps put you in touch with that person. You can also call the National Association of Scholars, or NAS, of which I am a director, and which I describe as the leading anti-political correctness organization. We don't hand out names of our members, but if we can contact our members, if you call the NAS and they have members at your institution, they will call those members and say, would you care to be in touch with somebody from the law school? And if so, then they will put you in touch. And you can start to work with other people from other divisions of your university. And by the way, if you are concerned about diversity not only in law schools but throughout universities, throughout the university, I do encourage you to join the NAS. It publishes the journal Academic Questions, which is worth it's $45 a year, and it's worth the price of a loan. So I encourage you to do that. A related issue would be to look at speech codes in your university. If you just talk about the lack of political diversity, sometimes it's hard to get a lot of people excited about it, but even people on the left tend to get upset about restrictive speech codes, and sometimes you can use that as a way of getting into the issue of political diversity. And I also want to talk more about the broader picture of academia generally and the lack of intellectual diversity in academia generally. To start to think about that, to first ask, what is it that university presidents and deans care about? What moves them? And certainly two things, maybe the only two things they care about, are money and publicity. Clearly, if you can get major donors to your school to raise issues of political diversity, the administration will listen. So here again, not just saying to the administration this is unfair, but making contact, and perhaps the Federalist Society could also be useful here, making contact with alumni at your law school who are donors and might also be willing to say to the powers that be, we see a problem with the lack of diversity here. I understand that a lot of foundations that have conservative sympathies have basically given up on academia, and they direct their money to independent organizations, think tanks and such, but feel that academia is a lost cause. And I think it's important for conservatives to say that it's difficult or impossible to win the war of ideas if you surrender the universities. Of course, we then need to come up with promising projects, because foundations fund projects, not organizations. And I hope that Robbie George can give us some ideas about how that can be done. Beyond that, a couple of other half-baked ideas. One thing law school deans care about is rankings and admissions. It might be useful to have an annual ranking of law schools in terms of viewpoint diversity. Here again, this might be a possible Federalist Society project, to let prospective law students know how welcome conservative and libertarian students will be at various schools. By the way, when Professor Tushnet spoke this morning about saying maybe conservative students should go to Pepperdine, it reminded me of the editorial recently in the Harvard Crimson, which said that conservative students, if conservative students don't feel comfortable at Harvard, good, that's the way we like it, get lost. That was their view on diversity. Other projects might try to help new and potential conservative legal scholars. How can we give these people a leg up? Money could be provided so that untenured professors could take a leave for a semester to work on scholarship. Although, as Jim Lindgren pointed out, I think once you're in the door, for the most part, the political problems are over. The big problem is to get your foot in the door. One possibility, many schools now are hiring visiting assistant professors because they're cheap and they improve your faculty-student ratio, and you don't make any commitment to them. Perhaps money could be found through some foundations to subsidize young scholars who want to go into teaching to be a visiting assistant professor for a year at some school. I suspect that any such subsidy would constitute the individual as tainted in the view of many legal scholars, but perhaps that would be one way to go. And the last thing I want to say, and I think this is suggested by all the things I've said before, is that this will require a lot of effort, and of effort of the kind that most of our scholars are not interested in. Most of us are interested in doing our scholarship in administrative law or commercial law or whatever area we're involved in, and not in playing university politics. But the conditions that exist now, and I think were very well described by Nicholas Rosencrantz earlier today. I think the situation at Georgetown is a little worse than it is at most other places, but only a little. That situation did not come about by accident. It came about by a lot of people who were very concerned to see that law schools have a particular political profile on their faculties, and that's not going to change unless a lot of people stand up and make a lot of noise and complain and demand equal treatment. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor George?
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to Joelle and to the Federalist Society for inviting me to participate in the meeting, and especially to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues. There are some people who hold a very old-fashioned view that legal education does not belong in the university context, that it is, or should be, a form of essentially technical and vocational education that should be conducted somewhere else. Universities should be devoted to the disinterested pursuit and transmission of knowledge, not to teaching people skills such as advocacy or working with statutes and legal texts and so forth. I'm a pretty old-fashioned guy, but not even I am old-fashioned enough to believe that. I believe that law schools do have a very important place on university campuses, and that we shouldn't conceive law schools as merely vocational and technical institutions that are not concerned about the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth. And because I have that view of law schools, I don't sharply distinguish legal education, at least in its truth-seeking dimension, and legal scholarship. I don't sharply distinguish that from scholarship in the arts and sciences. And I think that reflects what law schools' ambitions these days are. Law schools want to be places where real scholars really do scholarship. They are interested in the disinterested pursuit of truth, the creation of knowledge, the preservation of knowledge, and the transmission of knowledge. So to a very considerable extent, law schools are not, and shouldn't be, in my view, mere vocational technical institutions, but truth-seeking institutions, part of universities that have their mission, as their mission, the seeking of knowledge, the seeking of truth. And to that extent, then, of course, truth-seeking is the end that gives the institution its meaning, defines it as the kind of thing it is. It's how Aristotle teaches us to figure out what things are by what their aims are, what they do, what the end, the telos, is. So truth-seeking's got to be, it seems to me, rightly is, part of the mission. Now, I think I recall correctly that it was learned hand. At least I think I recall correctly that Charles Fried told us when I was studying jurisprudence here that it was learned hand, who said that the spirit of liberty is a spirit of being not too sure one is right. And I think that's probably right. That is part of the spirit of liberty. But I think it's also the spirit of truth-seeking, a sense of one's own fallibility, a sense that one could be wrong. Even in one's basic premises and most fundamental beliefs, I do think is essential to the project of truth-seeking. That's not to say that we should not be advocates of our point of view, or that we should not be engaged as scholars politically. I mean, I would be a gross hypocrite if I said something like that. I mean, I'm very notoriously engaged politically, always on the wrong side from my colleagues' point of view. So no, it doesn't mean that, but it does mean recognizing one's fallibility, that one could be wrong. And it requires, therefore, a certain sort of intellectual humility and personal humility, and certainly a willingness to entertain the other guy's arguments in a serious way, to listen to them just in case one is wrong and the other guy is right. I think the proper attitude to adopt is the attitude that Plato teaches us in the Gorgias to adopt. Socrates' attitude in the Gorgias. One that's looking for the friend who will benefit him enormously by showing him where, in fact, he's in error. Your truest friend, the guy who corrects you when you're wrong. So that openness to argument and to having one's premises and most fundamental beliefs and values challenged is terribly important to the truth-seeking mission that defines institutions like Harvard University and the Harvard Law School as the kinds of things they are. Now, it seems to me that orthodoxies create the very great risk of groupthink. It doesn't always happen, but very often it does, and it always creates a risk of groupthink. And groupthink is toxic to thought and inquiry, and thus to the mission of any intellectual community or institution. Now, part of the problem, of course, is when is the last time you met somebody who says, yeah, you know what my problem is? My problem is groupthink. I just think like everybody else around me. The trouble with groupthink is when you're in it, you don't know you're in it. And you will swear on a stack of Bibles or whatever your holy book is, even if it's, The Origin of Species, whatever your book is, you will swear on a stack of those books that you're not in groupthink, and you would pass a lie detector test that you're not in groupthink. But that doesn't mean that you're not in groupthink. And wherever there is an orthodoxy that can be identified by any of the various ways that previous panelists have talked about, whether they thought it was something worth worrying about or not, whenever you have the orthodoxies, I think you have to worry about the risks of groupthink, and you ought to be concerned about it. Now, it seems to me that viewpoint diversity, or I guess what we've been calling here at the conference intellectual diversity, has its value as a vaccine against groupthink and as an antidote to groupthink once it has set in. That's the real value, it seems to me, of intellectual diversity. People who have the spirit of being not too sure that they are right, people who want to be challenged because they know that being challenged is integral and indispensable to the process of truth-seeking, it seems to me will want to have viewpoint, intellectual diversity in order to accomplish the mission of the institution. I very strongly suspect this is what Joel and the group, Federalist Society folks who put this conference together, are motivated by. It's not, it's just an abstract appeal to fairness. Well, it's just not fair, right? Somebody could say, it's just not fair that there are 67 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Or it's just not fair that everybody is for same-sex marriage and nobody's defending the conjugal understanding of marriage. Now, we could debate whether there's a serious issue there with fairness. It just doesn't happen to be what I'm arguing for here. I'm arguing for intellectual diversity, not by abstract appeal to fairness as an abstract ideal or principle, but rather to it as being integral to the truth-seeking process. Now, of course, we all know that it's pretty hard to get this intellectual diversity. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, and I didn't hear I only heard part of the last panel, so I didn't hear the panels before. So maybe some of these things have been covered. Nicholas certainly covered one of the ones that I want to focus on, which is this. while in my own experience it's true, and some of my more liberal colleagues tell me that in their experience it's true, that there is sometimes just conscious discrimination against people who dissent from campus orthodoxies in hiring and promotion. So we can't have their type here. Jeffrey Stout, my colleague in the religion department at Princeton, has mentioned his own experience in being in hiring committees or departmental meetings. He says it's happened twice with two different candidates, where it was simply openly said by some participants in the meeting that, well, this candidate is not appropriate for us because this candidate is pro-life. The people saying that, just assuming that everybody else would go along. Jeffrey, to his credit, is a wonderful person, true scholar, true intellectual. To his very great credit, is not of that view and objected to any consideration of that. So sometimes it is conscious, but I think, and I think, Nicholas, I'm echoing you here, I believe I am, I think that's not the fundamental problem. I think that's comparatively rare. I could cite some cases that I know about. I know cases like the ones Jeff Stout has reported to me. Probably other people in the academy could mention their cases. I think the more fundamental problem is I didn't know whether to call this unconscious or subconscious, so I'm going to just say non-conscious discrimination. That's this problem. In this vale of tears, we human beings, fallen and frail creatures that we are, have a lot of trouble appreciating good work and even good arguments when they run contrary to our own opinions, especially when we're deeply emotionally invested in those opinions, or the subject matters about which they are opinions. This isn't a liberal problem or a progressive or a left-wing problem. It's a human nature problem. Anytime, it wouldn't matter whether you got a left-wing orthodoxy or a right-wing orthodoxy. It doesn't matter what kind of institution it is. Wherever you would find an overwhelming dominant opinion on one side, it's going to be very difficult for a lot of people to draw the distinction between work I disagree with, despite its being really very good and challenging and interesting and important, and work that goes contrary to what I just know to be true and what's really important and critical to me, and bound up with my sense of who I am as a fill in the blank, progressive, or for that matter, conservative. Now, my friend and colleague Alan Kors at the University of Pennsylvania, with whom I'm usually in complete agreement about everything, disagrees with me about this. He thinks it's a liberal and progressive problem, not a human nature problem. He thinks it's something to do with the left. I don't think it's something to do with the left. I think it really is a human nature problem, and you would have it wherever you have orthodoxies. So when I ask myself the question, well, what should we do? I'm not in a position of having much power in doing it, but I would say to my friends who are on the more liberal side of the street and who perceive the problem as I do and think something needs to be done about it, say, well, one, of course, we need to strike against any conscious discrimination based on viewpoint. And secondly, we really need, by precept and example, to strongly encourage people to be self-critical. It's an essential virtue for scholarship anyway, right? Being self-critical. So we need to encourage people to be self-critical so that they really will be able to say, as I might say about the work of, let's say, my colleague at Princeton, Peter Singer. Well, I'm really scandalized by his advocacy of infanticide. But, there's an argument here he makes that's got to be met. And the burden is on me to make the argument that our dignity as human beings comes by virtue of our humanity, or by our status as rational creatures, or creatures bearing a rational nature, possessing, at least in radical form from the very beginning, from the earliest embryonic stage, the radical capacities for the types of characteristically human activities that we think of as the things that give human beings dignity. The burden's on me to meet his challenge, right? I want my colleagues on the other side to take the same position about work by more conservative scholars, especially in these hot-button areas. But I acknowledge that it's hard to do. And it's especially hard to do when the orthodoxy is in place, because you're not hearing arguments for the other side. And when you're not hearing them, and everybody you know and everybody in your circle tends to think the same thing about that body of issues, no matter how much diversity there is on other stuff. When you have that, the motivation to think more critically just is hard to work up. It really is. So it's best not to get yourself into this fix in the first place by letting those orthodoxies form. But if you're in them, we just have to do our best to get people to really appreciate work and be willing to say that they appreciate and acknowledge work that that's good but that they disagree with. I wanted to give a couple of examples of the value of viewpoint or intellectual diversity, again from my own experience. One is the Madison program at Princeton. The program was founded 12 years ago. Its impact on the intellectual culture of Princeton, precisely by bringing viewpoint diversity into Princeton in a serious way, I think has been salutary. And many, many, many of my liberal colleagues have more than acknowledged but have praised the Madison program for that. There's just more people around who think different things, even about fundamental issues that everybody cares about, and which, to the outside world, everybody assumes that academics are on one side of and not the other side of. It's great because it means that in general discussions across the university, and not just stuff that the Madison program sponsors, programs in the history department, programs in the Center for Human Values where Professor Singer is, programs across the university, people cannot simply rely on everybody in the room sharing the assumptions. They know they have to defend their premises. That makes for a different and much better and more serious engagement, profoundly, I think, improving the quality of intellectual life. The second example, again from my own experience, is the experience I've had teaching with my very dear friend and colleague, Cornel West. Now, Cornel and I, we disagree about a few things. But we have taught together. We've 3-hour seminars, straight through a semester, beginning with Sophocles' Antigone, ending with Martin Luther King's letter to the Birmingham jail, with everything in between, from Machiavelli to Hayek, Marx to Dewey, St. Augustine to C.S. Lewis, W.E.B. Du Bois. And what has struck me, first of all, it's just been a lot of fun. That's good. I think it's a great benefit to the students as well, and here's why. I've always prided myself as a teacher on being able to represent really well the other side's point of view, a point of view that I don't share. So if I'm teaching, Roe versus Wade, or something having to do with affirmative action, or pornography and First Amendment, or whatever it is in my constitutional interpretation classes or my civil liberties classes, I like to think, and I think I do, that if someone came in who happened not to know what most of my students do know what my views are because they seem to be all over the internet. But if someone came in not knowing my views, they actually wouldn't know which side I'm on. And that's not because I think we should hide the ball or anything like that. It's just that I pride myself in being able to represent the best arguments, not only for my own positions, but for positions I don't hold. What I learned in teaching with Cornel, though, is this. As well as I think I have done it, I have not done it well enough. The evidence for that is simply this. Time after time, in the course of, 12 weeks at a go, each time we teach the course, I find that he has said something in response to a point that I made that simply would not have occurred to me. And it's a serious point that needs to be engaged and dealt with. I wouldn't have thought of it. I would have done my best to represent his side. I wouldn't have thought of it. And he tells me that he has had the same experience time and time again. Points or arguments that he had never heard of and hadn't considered and would not have been able to represent in his classes. Now that I think is a very good argument for intellectual diversity. By the way, I think it's a very good argument for team teaching. I think team teaching is a wonderful thing to do, especially if you have people who disagree about things. And it could be, and it doesn't have to be political things, it could be, disagreements about the proper interpretation of Shakespeare or any of a range of other areas, especially, of course, in the humanities and social sciences. But it's a very valuable thing to do, and more of it should be done. And I think in an ideal atmosphere of intellectual diversity, you really want to take advantage. As I was here, I've never met Professor Fallon. Yeah, I think it's the first time meeting each other. As I was sitting listening to him on the previous panel, I was thinking, you know what? I agree with some of what he says. I disagree with some of what he says. I'd love to teach with that guy. That's, I think, an ideal way of ensuring that students really do engage the best arguments on the competing sides. Well, okay, I've taken more than my time. I have more to say. I'll stop there and we'll see what happens in the Q&A.
Thanks very much. Professor Suk?
Thank you so much, the Federal Society, for inviting me. It's really great to hear my fellow panelists' comments, and I wish I had been here earlier today, but I was teaching from 10 to 3, and so I didn't have the benefit of hearing all that was discussed during the preceding panels. So by the time we get here to our panel, we're already at solutions, and find that I've missed out on the posing and explication of the problems. So, and of course, to propose and discuss solutions, one of course has to have a good sense of the contours of the problem. And I was getting a little bit of a catch up from my wonderful former student, Dan Loveland, but I want to also give you my reconstruction and retracing first of the way I think about the problem. So the topic is encouraging intellectual diversity, and to make an approach toward the solution of encouraging intellectual diversity, one has to know what intellectual diversity is and what it is for. What is intellectual diversity and what is its purpose? We heard, I think, some wonderful comments on this panel already, trying to get at what it is, what it's for. And so here are a few visions of intellectual diversity that I have played with. I'm going to be a little bit reductive as I try to disentangle and to make explicit the different meanings that the concept of intellectual diversity has taken on in public discourse. So first is a vision that I'm going to call allegorical diversity. Allegory is, as you may know, a literary device in which characters in a story or in a picture are to be read as symbols representing a distinct idea or a concept. Right? So there is a one-to-one correspondence between a certain character and the ideas that he represents. Right? To make the most illustrative and famous example visible to you would be from the 17th century, Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan's Christian allegory, features the characters named, for example, Christian, Mr. Worldly Wise Man, Goodwill, Obstinate, Pliable Formalist, Prudence, Charity, Ignorance, and Envy. You get the idea. Right, so, well, sometimes when people talk about intellectual diversity, it sounds to me as though what they want is this kind of allegorical diversity, the vision of a university or a classroom as a collection of representatives, whether it's on a faculty or a student body. Sometimes it seems like the idea is that the person should represent certain viewpoints, that they should have certain perspectives that they stand for, or commitments, or politics, or a certain background, or values, or experiences that they're somehow going to be a symbol of, and that they're going to express these things in the educational setting, and that is a contribution that each person is going to make to this general tableau of a university classroom. And each person will perform that role with the imperative to generate a diverse university setting. That's what I think of as allegorical diversity. It's not an accident that allegory is a literary device because there's something aesthetic about this preference for allegorical diversity, the pleasure of looking out at an intellectual community and knowing that you have people of different types represented, that you have the Marxist, you have the feminist, you have the conservative, the liberal, the libertarian. And if literary tropes don't quite do it for you, the sort of other mundane version that I think of is the zoo theory of faculty diversity, that, like, if you go to the zoo, you should have an elephant. Any self-respecting zoo would have an elephant and a tiger and a panda and a lion, and students should go get to see all of these animals in the zoo, and they'll be shortchanged if they've paid their tuition and there's no elephant, or they're only lions and they don't get to see a panda, or there's an extinct species and so the zoo couldn't get a hold of one, right? So as you might be able to tell, this is not exactly my vision of intellectual diversity. It's not the one that moves me, right? Although I acknowledge that this is one that has some purchase. Allegory, to me, has the risk of creating stock characters, which is why, with the rise of, for example, the modern novel, with its exploration of psychological and narrative complexity, we have seen allegory recede in prominence as a literary rhetorical device. So, vision number 2, which is related, but I think distinct. And I call this kind of diversity interpersonal difference diversity. It's the idea that in a university classroom, the education, part of what's essential about that education is to learn from the intersubjective exposure and sharing, right? Kind of an empathy for the other, or a broadening of one's distinctive but narrow experience through the exposure to the other's distinctive but narrow experience to get a fuller picture of human experience. Also, the importance of debate and discussion with those who just think differently from you, and the possibility that one's views and perspectives can change because of this experience. This is very central to education. It is one that I find to be very valuable. Third vision of intellectual diversity. Here I'm going to parse the words a little differently. I think of it as an intellectual's diversity. It's about what's internal to the intellectual, right? So the diversity of the mind of an intellectual. It's about intra rather than interpersonal diversity. So in this regard, I think about what we do in the university as creating human beings who will have this kind of diversity within them, that they will do this through the deep study and reading of various very, very different kinds of texts and subjects, and engaging with different kinds of thinkers and disciplines, that they will study and master different languages, whether it will be legal languages or whether we think that they should become bilingual, which I think bilingualism is also a version of this kind of diversity, whether that we think it's philosophical language or literary language that we want them to master. We want them to understand the distinctive ways in which different disciplines organize and produce knowledge and get at the truth about our world. We want them to understand what it is you gain and what it is you lose, what it is you see and what it is you miss with each different way of knowing that they're exposed to. So it is this last diversity that I care about the most. And that's the one that plays the greatest role in how I think about teaching students. It's not that I think allegorical diversity or interpersonal difference diversity are to be avoided. It's that the ultimate goal of education, the reason I'm so committed to it, the reason that I've chosen to spend my life in a university, is to create free individuals, to create free human beings. It's that the ultimate goal of education, that it is to be free not only to disagree with others, but also free inside to explore thought where it leads. So Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "To have doubted one's own first principles is the mark of a civilized man." And to me, that's intellectual diversity. Stock allegorical characters are not free, right? They're supposed to stick to a script. Neither are people occupying the role of representing a certain viewpoint or an experience or a set of values. I care most about an intellectual's internal freedom and the experience of internal intellectual diversity as a way to be freer people. So how do we encourage that in our students in this university setting? In a way, I find that legal education is in some ways wonderfully suited to this project, because students have to be trained, law students have to be trained to argue one side of a case and to argue the other side with equal strength and reason. That is integral to a legal education. And that is what we do. That's what we're supposed to do. I've also been inspired in some way. One of my former teachers, Janet Halley, who is my colleague here, she has a book called Split Decisions, How and Why to Take a Break from Feminism. And split decisions, I mean, the title Split Decisions, what does it mean? Split decisions, she's referring, of course, to legal decisions that are split, that when members of an appellate court cannot agree, you'll have a majority and you'll have a dissent. And it's something that all lawyers are familiar with, they all know it. And it's a great device, the way that opinions come with majorities and dissent. It's a great device for teaching students to reason through different sides of a case. And then her subtitle, How and Why to Take a Break from Feminism. The idea of taking a break from feminism was enormously liberating for me when I saw that. I and others have experienced this enormous feeling of liberation, having come of age in a feminist era, right? We all grew up in a feminist era. And the idea that you could take a break, right, that you wouldn't necessarily be an apostate or an abandoner, right, that you could just take a break, that you would get a breather. It would allow you to breathe and see things a little more clearly in a different way, that it could be experimental, that it could be pleasurable, but also that, like taking a break in the sense of a vacation, but also taking a break in the sense of when you take a break from if you break up with someone, it's fraught with risk. It might never be mended, this break, but it could well be, right? You could take a break and get back together, right? So breaking something is also part of it. Breaking up, spring break, right? Also putting a break on things. And that idea, right, of taking a break is one that has been really central to me in the way I try to teach students. So for example, if, debate and discussion, of course, is the centerpiece of Socratic teaching. You ask student questions, they give answers, you ask them other questions, but you also ask them to argue the other side. I teach criminal law and family law. There are many very controversial subjects in those courses. One teaching technique that I also learned from my former teacher, Janet Halley, is something that we call the no personal narratives rule, right? I don't want students, I don't allow them to speak in class as anything, right? As a Asian man or a black woman or a liberal or a conservative or whatever, right? Libertarian. I don't want them to speak as I want them to feel free not to have to represent like allegorical characters in a diversity tableau. I want them to think. I don't want to think they are educational types for their classmates to be given exposure to. Right? I want them all just to think, and to think diversely, each of them, right? That they may not think the same things at the beginning of class that they will at the end of class. And the way I and many other Socratic teachers do this is through the demanding of role performance, to ask them to play the role of a Richard Posner or a Catherine McKinnon or a Justice Scalia, to make the argument and its opposite, to say the thing and its refutation. I want to cultivate students' capacity to be intellectually free, to teach students how and why to take a break from whatever it is, whether it's the orthodoxies that are all around, whether it's the position you happen to hold now, the idea that they can take a break, that is what will enable them to be free. So intellectual diversity, the diversity of an intellectual's mind, is what I want to devote my life to as a legal educator, because it is what I believe is essential to a free society and a democracy worth the name.
Thank you. Professor Campos.
Thank you. I have a lot of things I'd like to say. I realize the hour is late and the serotonin levels are rising, so I will try to speak quickly and hopefully engagingly. Professor Calabresi started by making a joke about Harvard and Yale, which is, we didn't actually plan this, but it's a perfect lead-in to what I was going to say. I think that there is a very big problem with intellectual diversity within the American Legal Academy today, but I want to take this in a slightly different direction from the many, many interesting things that have already been said today. 40% of new law faculty hires today, roughly speaking, are Harvard and Yale Law School graduates. So that means that at most law schools, Harvard and Yale Law School graduates will, if they don't already, form a strong plurality of the graduates of the law school, affiliations of the law school faculty. This effect is much, much stronger at Harvard and Yale itself than it is at law schools in general. 39 of the 47 tenured track members of the Yale Law faculty are graduates of either Yale or Harvard Law School. At Harvard, I was counting, but I only got up to Dershowitz, and I just gave up because the faculty is too large. So, but the proportion was essentially about the same. Pretty much everybody graduated from either Harvard or Yale. There's a few slackers from proletarian places like Columbia, but pretty much it's Harvard and Yale, right? Now, this is really kind of curious from the perspective of academia in general, because there's a sort of general rule in academics that you want to avoid intellectual incest. You don't hire your own generally in academia, right? There's kind of a rule: if you go and get a PhD at a particular program, they will not hire you there, or at least not for a long, long time, because they understandably don't want to just. Somebody mentioned earlier, I can't remember, when one of the earlier panels said that institutions just want to replicate themselves, and that's true, they do, but at the same time they have other desires, such as expanding knowledge and discovering truth. And in order to do that, you really do need a kind of intellectual diversity, which is not advanced by this kind of intellectual incest. But when it comes to intellectual incest, legal academia is basically Chinatown. It's just that's what we engage in all the time, and it's getting more and more pronounced. This is connected with something that Professor North said earlier, which when she pointed out that there's a sort of dearth of practice experience among legal academics. The numbers here are genuinely startling. There's a recent study of this issue which found that at top 25 law schools, the average amount of practice experience among those faculty who had practice experience was 1.4 years. There are 66 faculty members at top 25 law schools right now who do not have a law degree of any kind. There's also a significant subset who have no practice experience. And those who do have practice experience, the practice experience tends to be very narrow. It tends to be very rarefied. A few years at a top law firm as a junior associate, or perhaps very fancy government work, and this happens for understandable reasons. But what it ends up producing, I think, is the opposite of certainly the certain kinds of diversity that we should be very concerned with. And let me speak up to a kind of diversity which hasn't gotten mentioned much at all today yet, and that's a diversity that comes from a genuine diversity of socioeconomic circumstances. Now, I'm not aware of anyone who's done an ethnography of the faculties of top law schools, but just impressionistically, I get the sense that there are a lot of people on top law school faculties who use summer as a verb, basically, which is something that I hadn't really encountered until I was sort of in this milieu, for a while. And that, I think, leads to a certain narrowness of perspective. I think this was sort of hinted at earlier, and I'll just say it more bluntly. I mean, I think there's probably more diversity in having somebody from a genuinely working class background on a law school faculty than to have an African American faculty member whose parents were both doctors who grew up in Shaker Heights, Ohio. I mean, this is in one sense a kind of banal point, but it's one that I think is worth emphasizing, especially under the current economic circumstances in which law schools and law students find themselves. And what are those precisely? Well, here let me give you a few figures which you're simply not going to believe, or a lot of you won't anyways, because you'll think I'm making them up because they're so incredible. But these numbers are all inflation adjusted, okay? So I'm speaking in terms of current 2012 dollars, not nominal dollars. I was tipped off to this when I was talking to Paul Carrington about his experiences as a Harvard Law student back in the early 1950s, and he told me he was paying $600 a year in tuition. And I didn't believe him. So I went and I thought, oh, he's an old guy. He must have like be confused about this. He's just forgetting, the people think, oh, I paid like a nickel for a hamburger or whatever. So I went up, and you can find this all on the internet now, like everything else, right? And sure enough, he remembered perfectly well exactly what his tuition was at Harvard in the early 1950s. It was $600, which is $5,100 in current 2012 dollars. And then working it through, it was $8,000 in the mid-1960s, $12,000 in 1971, $15,000, almost $16,000 in 1981, $27,000 in 1991, $36,000 in 2001, and it's like $52,000 today. And again, all of that is in inflation-adjusted dollars, right? So Harvard Law School is 10 times more expensive now than it was 60 years ago. And of course, that's just representative of what's happened in academia in general. Now, the reason I mention this is because I think there's a kind of blindness that we are laboring under within legal academia right now, which is a product of the tremendously narrowness of vision that in a sense is produced by having everyone in positions of influence and power come from the same narrow institutional and to a lesser extent socioeconomic circumstances. This is not such a big problem at Harvard and Yale as it is, and Stanford, as it is just about everywhere else, right? Because at Harvard and Yale and Stanford, the tremendous cost of legal education still has some basis or connection to economic rationality, unlike at the vast majority of law schools, where the cost of legal education no longer bears a rational relationship to the outcomes that law graduates of those schools to a significant extent are experiencing. And, in having looked at this in quite a bit of detail lately, I have just been struck over and over again by the extent to which we have lost sight in legal academia of how the diverse experiences that our graduates are having do not really necessarily hook up very much with what we're most concerned about inside the legal academy. Now, I agree completely with Professor George that liberal education is a wonderful thing, and that thinking about jurisprudential issues is a wonderful thing, and I love to think about those things, and I don't want to think about anything having to do with being a lawyer, because I frankly don't really know very much about that, like most legal academics. And so I would, I would love to join him at the Center for Advanced Study or what have you, and live my life along those lines. But the problem is that vision of legal education just doesn't work economically anymore for the vast majority of our students. And what I would like to make a call for here is a genuine form of diversity in the structure of legal education. Look, Harvard Law School is a wonderful place. Yale Law School is a wonderful place. But we do not need 200 Harvard Law Schools or Yale Law Schools. I'm not sure we need 20. In other words, yes, there should be graduate schools in law in the United States that have 50 people like Robbie George on them. I'm totally in favor of that. But that's not what all law schools or even most law schools ought to look like, because it's too expensive and it doesn't fit the economic realities that law graduates, not so much Harvard law graduates, although the waterline is rising, but law graduates from from most law schools are experiencing today. I'm going to read you an email I got just quite recently, simply because it's a form of testimony that I think is important to hear. I get stuff like this all the time, and it's not comfortable to hear, but I think it's important to hear. Okay, this is someone who graduated a few years ago from a mid-rank law school. I grew up poor but got good grades, was interested in social policy, and figured after acing the LSAT that I would go to law school. I never had any experience working with the law, but I figured that you could do anything with a law degree, and there would be no shortage of challenging but rewarding work. I was 22 years old and thought a law degree would be a fine, conservative investment. I felt that if I worked hard and got an education, that at least I wouldn't be scraping to make ends meet and living off food stamps and welfare like my parents did. I wonder how many Harvard law students would have a background that would resonate with that. Needless to say, this plan got great applause from all quarters. I graduated from law school in 2005 with about $150,000 of educational debt. I was one of the lucky ones. I got a job with legal aid. I can't afford my student loan payments and live. They're $889 a month. After 6 years of paying my debt, I have made no dent in the principal. I have been looking for a better paying job now for 3 years. None exist in this state, and I can't afford to relocate and buy a new professional wardrobe and take another bar exam, and there aren't any jobs anywhere else anyway. The last several years have destroyed my credit, and my phone rings constantly with debt collection calls, and every month I'm further in the red. Over the last 6 years, I have discovered that I hate our system of justice, our courts, our law, and everyone remotely connected to them. I hate the actual work of being a lawyer and having to deal with other lawyers. Being chained to this computer and phone every day feels like torture. It has affected my physical and mental health negatively. I don't want to talk or interact with people, and the anger and rage I feel every day has swallowed up my sense of humor. It doesn't help that most of my clients are extremely vulnerable, mentally unstable, and treated with the utmost contempt by every human being they come in contact with, including other poor people who assume that they are the deserving poor and everyone else is a malingering parasite. Luckily, in our small office, I can close the door and sob hysterically without anyone much noticing. I feel terrible taking up a scarce job that someone else may be able to love and run with and really work the hell out of, while I hang on and avoid work as much as possible. The people I work with are the best people in the world, and I feel like I'm taking advantage of them. But I don't feel like I have any choice but to keep going due to the debt and lack of other employment options, especially options that would pay enough to help me make a dent in my payments. It doesn't help that a lot of my work is counseling clients who are about to become homeless for the first time in their lives and are mired in homelessness. Their desperation and anxiety are seeping into me. Bankruptcy offers no hope of being able to start over with a clean slate because, student debt is not dischargeable in bankruptcy. If I leave or lose this job, not only do I lose everything I have, a roof over my head, a vehicle, and steady employment, but everything that I could get in the future. Any wages will be severely garnished, no credit will ever be extended, no savings can ever be accumulated in a banking institution, tax returns will be intercepted, and Social Security will be garnished. I have elderly clients whose Social Security is being garnished for education debt that has increased 500% due to the age of the loan. It isn't pretty. At best, I can live underground off the books and hope that I die young. If I could return my degree in exchange for having the remaining debt written off, I would do so in a heartbeat. The amount of contempt I feel for myself for getting in this situation is killing me. If I wasn't married to someone who would be destroyed by my death, I would probably commit suicide. I irrevocably screwed up my life at age 22, and I'm looking down a long, dark hole that is the rest of my life. And my options keep going around and around in my head, and they aren't getting any better. I don't see any way forward. Is there any hope?
Horrible.
Yeah, I get stuff like that a lot. In fact, I used to do a blog until about a month ago that spoke to this particular crisis, and I had to stop doing it partially because I couldn't take getting these kinds of things anymore. It's very emotionally disturbing to me to think about the relationship between my job and these messages that I'm getting. Right? I think this is closely connected to a form of intellectual diversity that we desperately need right now in legal academia, which is the intellectual diversity that comes from engaging with the desperation of people who are in economically desperate circumstances that have been produced by the economic structure that we are operating within right now within legal academia. Not at Harvard Law School with its $2 billion endowment, who can basically throw a life raft to any of its students that need one. Hopefully they will do so, but just about everywhere else. And so I want to leave a little time for questions, but I guess maybe this isn't the most appropriate forum for this particular message, but I would like to at least perhaps to speak to any faculty or students who are out there who are thinking about what reaction they ought to have to this kind of message. Harvard Law School is a great place, but we don't need 200 Harvard Law Schools. And I think intellectual diversity is a virtue which can help recognize that particular truth, if it is a truth. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to take my prerogative as moderator as a chance to agree with a couple of things that various members of the panels said and then mention two additional points. First, I very strongly agree with Robbie George on the importance of humility in teaching and in scholarship. I think of the 7 deadly sins, the one that law professors are most prone to is pride. Sloth may be a close runner-up, but pride definitely takes first place. Second, I echo also what Robbie said about team teaching. I've co-taught constitutional law with Michael Perry and with Andy Koppelman. We disagree vehemently about constitutional law. I love team teaching it with them and look forward to team teaching future courses as well. Third, I wanted to mention an assignment that I always give to my constitutional law students as a way of encouraging thinking about intellectual diversity. And that is, I asked them to take the single case that they read in constitutional law that they thought was the most significant or that they were most moved by, and rewrite the majority opinion in that case to say what it ought to have said had the justice written it correctly. Obviously, many people choose to rewrite Brown versus Board of Education or Roe versus Wade. But that's only half of the assignment. I also asked them to then write a dissent to the majority opinion that they just wrote. And many students have told me that they find that job of writing a majority opinion and then dissenting from their own opinion to be very educational. I did want to ask Robbie a little bit about the dichotomy between law schools as either being truth-seeking institutions or trade schools, because I think of law schools as being a little bit different from being either truth-seeking institutions or trade schools. I think law schools are, like engineering schools and medical schools, a place where abstract academic knowledge meets the real world. It seems to me that law is very much at the point of intersection between political philosophy and action and politics. And so I don't think it's sufficient just to be a humble truth seeker. I think one actually needs to be engaged in political action to some extent as well, as Professor George in fact is. But then related to that, there's also the very important point that Professor Norris made on the last panel, which is that it's important that law professors who are truth seekers recognize that there's a separation between law and politics. That your political views are not necessarily the same thing as the law. So I thought I should ask Professor George, just as a question, to what extent do you think that law schools are like engineering schools and medical schools, and therefore concerned with truth-seeking, but also concerned with the real world?
Well, I agree that they are. They're truth-seeking, but also concerned with the real world. And they're concerned with the transmission of skills that will enable people to make a positive contribution to the real world, to the system of justice, to medicine, to the building of buildings and bridges and so forth in engineering or computer science or what have you. I tried to state it carefully. I did not want to, I hope I didn't suggest that law schools don't have that real world dimension, or that that's not part of the mission. It is part of the mission. I wanted to stress that it's not the entire mission, and that therefore the university has a place where some people, the law school has a place where some people think it doesn't have a place, which is actually in the university considered as fundamentally a truth-seeking institution and enterprise. So have I made myself clear, or would you
Yes,
want to push me any harder? Can I, though, while I have the floor, say a couple of things, again, really to affirm what one of the other panelists said. It's Professor Suk. Two things I think she said are really critically important. One is to understand the role of sincere, serious truth-seeking, of education, and of the role of the professor in the educational process, as including quite centrally and vitally giving a kind of inner freedom to the learner. The learner needs inner freedom in order to learn, and part of the goal is the inner freedom that comes with knowledge. In an essay of my own on this subject, on the liberal arts, entitled Self-Mastery in the Liberal Arts, I make the argument that what is liberating about the liberal arts, when it's done well, is that it makes one the master of one's own passions and desires and even passionately held views, puts one in charge, and thus orders the soul properly, as Plato would have it, where the rational really is in charge of the spirit and the passionate. And the passionate is not in control and instrumentalizing reason to some other agenda. I think that's terribly important. And it's just important in law schools in their dimension as truth-seeking and truth-transmitting institutions as it is in the arts and sciences. The second point that she made that I think is so important, and she's articulated it much better than I would have. I have the rule sort of informally. She's made it formal, and I'm going to just steal that, and that is the no personal narratives rule. I think that's an extremely important, especially in an environment like the one that we're in our own culture of quite radical moral pluralism. I think that's a very important rule in the educational process. But it's one rule that I think serves a larger end, and that is the end of not letting anybody and not letting circumstances or a smothering groupthink or orthodoxy shut down debate. My problem with the personal narratives thing, when I've seen it deployed in classes or in faculty seminars or in public lectures in the Q&A period, is that it becomes a technique for shutting down debate. You know, I tell you about myself, and since you disagree with me, you're negating my personhood, and you're not entitled to say that opinion. You're not even really entitled to have that opinion. That's an assault and offense against me. Anything that shuts down thinking and debate like that is antithetical to the ends of the university.
I would definitely agree with that. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on one another's remarks or anything that's been said so far?
I really want to take Professor George's class.
Question, Professor Norse.
I'd like to ask Professor George why he doesn't think liberalism is the problem. And this is experiential, so I suppose I'll put it in non-experiential terms. There's a paradox to the traditional democratic liberal, which is that they deny the notion of character or virtue, even though they have a very strong notion of character and virtue. Paradox of liberalism. They deny they have a notion of character and virtue, even though they have a very strong one. They believe that your character and virtue is tied to your political views. And so you said that you had rejected that because one of your colleagues believes that probably it's human nature. And I agree with you because I talked about dogmatism earlier. I think it's very important to fight dogmatism in many, many ways. But I'm just, taking the contrary position.
Sure.
Which is to say, liberalism might be at fault because my understanding of many conservatives is that they actually believe in character and virtue, whereas liberals deny that they have a view of character and virtue, even though they have one. So it's a dogmatist denial.
Okay. Well, my reason is this. As McIntyre and others have reminded us, there are liberalisms, plural, not just a liberalism. And it is true that a view claiming the label liberal became pretty prominent in the second half of the 20th century, saying, look, we don't have a theory about character and virtue. We float independently of that. We've got our reasons for the policies and so forth and the institutional arrangements that we favor that don't have to do with character and virtue. But that's really just one liberalism, one that's especially, I think, vulnerable to attack from the conservative side and took quite a beating, even in its most sophisticated forms. But then there are all the other liberalisms that are right up front in saying, there's a liberal theory of character and there's a liberal theory of virtue. My colleague Steve Macedo has written an entire book called Liberal Virtues. Amy Gutman, used to be my colleague at Princeton, now president of the University of Pennsylvania, has made similar sorts of arguments in books and articles, that liberalism is not a theory about why you don't need virtues, but it's got a distinctive set of arguments about character and virtue and so forth. It doesn't claim to be neutral on those issues. So I've contributed pretty extensively to the critique of that first form of liberalism, but it, I think, no longer even really has the dominant position in liberal political philosophy. I think that people see what the problem with that is and have moved toward a different kind of, and sometimes in full bore, sometimes all the way over to a full-blown perfectionist liberalism, such as one of my former teachers, Joseph Raz, in his book, The Morality of Freedom, and in later articles.
Professor Rosenkranz.
I wanted to ask a question of Professor George. So I think you and I are agreeing that the discrimination, to the extent there's discrimination, is largely, I think you said, non-conscious, sub or perhaps unconscious. There are some examples of conscious discrimination. I've seen them, and you cited a couple of examples as well, which is say, we simply should not be hiring anyone who worked for the Bush administration or something. I've heard such cases, but that's not what we usually hear. What you hear often, and I'll take it as an example, originalists. You don't quite hear, let's not hire him because he's Republican, and you don't quite hear, let's not hire him because he's an originalist. We do hear something like this. The work is too formalistic and not sufficiently attuned to real-world consequences. And now that purports to be an assessment on the merits. And there's a sense in which it is an assessment on the merits. And so how quite do we combat that kind of discrimination when it's so hard to tease out the politics from the law?
It's a very difficult question. I wish I had an answer, and I don't. Now, you see it going the other direction as well. You see people who say, look, in political science, for example, at some institutions, we don't want any of those formal and quantitative modeling rational choice people around here because they're imperialistic and they take over. But then you have some people who say, some people who favor a more formalistic approach and quantitative approach to political science saying, well, look, these people who do this old-fashioned behavioral institutional political science, I mean, that's not rigorous. That's not really scholarship. They're just opining. They don't have anything really to say. It's just thick description of phenomena. Now, my own approach in my own department has been, here I'm violating the rule about personal narratives, Professor Suk, but I just telling you what I think is the right thing to do is I think let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? So I think you've got a lot of serious people who think the formal and quantitative approach is a good approach. Well, we need to be represented in that, and we need to find the very best people we can find on that side. I also think that should not get the status of an orthodoxy or be permitted to exclude more, quote, old-fashioned institutional and behavioral approaches to political science and comparative politics or international relations or American politics or what have you. And I think that's generally a pretty good approach, even when it comes to the kinds of viewpoint diversity issues that I think Joelle convened the conference having in mind. So if I look at a law school faculty or a philosophy or political science faculty where people are dealing with issues like the issues in Roe versus Wade or the marriage questions or affirmative action or whatever it is, and I look and I see, there's really nobody here, or it's very few people, almost nobody here who represents what's to be said on one side of the issue. Everything is on the other side. First thing that would come to my mind is, well, okay, I don't want to do affirmative action, but maybe there's a reason, that's not such a good reason why we're not represented. So let's look out there. Who are the very best people making the arguments in the scholarly journals for this other position? Now, why don't we have them here? Why don't we steal them? They should be here so we can have the kind of debate that goes on in places where there's a Rawls and a Nozick, both at Harvard, but on any of a range of other. I mean, unless you think there's just, for whatever reason, you think that there's just nobody who's very smart and has anything interesting to say on whatever is the other side from my side about abortion or sexuality and marriage or affirmative action or pornography or whatever it is. And I think if that's your view, maybe you better think again.
I'd like to just amplify on Professor Rosenkranz's observation and mention in particular arguments that I have had with some former teachers in law school who tend to dismiss originalism either because it's too textualist and therefore formalist and disconnected with the real world, even though that is in fact the approach that perhaps Justices Scalia and Thomas are following on the Supreme Court, or who dismiss originalist scholarship because they claim it's law office history. And usually the law office history claim boils down to you didn't write a study of all the intellectual currents of the late 18th century. You just looked for the meaning of the word commerce in dictionaries and newspapers. That's lawyers' work. That's not really valuable. But in fact, for originalism or for originalist judges or members of the public, it may well be valuable. Professor Lindgren.
Comment first on Paul Campos. When I was a graduate student in sociology in my education sociology class, They taught us that education is both the primary route to maintaining the existing social hierarchy and the primary route for social mobility, people moving up. And it's probably still doing those things, though I'm less sanguine about the latter than I used to be. And search for truth, one of the things that's consistent with what people have said about it, but I wanted to emphasize is just because something is good doesn't mean that the university has to decide to do it. And it's essentially the move that Locke made. I mean, Locke was highly religious, wrote a treatise on Christianity, but he said that the state doesn't have to promote everything that's good. It may be that you want to leave religion out of the state, and that really led to a great reduction in wars over such things. And it's similar a bit to the Calvin Report's comment at the University of Chicago about saying the university is the home of critics, not a critic itself. So the university should not be taking positions on general social issues, I think, for the most part. And then I wanted to comment a bit on Jeannie Suk's comments, because I agree with pretty much everything, but I'm not sure I felt the same way about where that led to. I mean, most of the arguments I've heard about representativeness of candidates have been either about minority candidates, either male or female. If they lean to the right, they're not authentic. Or about white female candidates, if they lean to the right, they're not authentic. You know, people don't recognize that white female candidates voted for Romney in the last election, not for Obama. They voted more for Romney. And so if you look at the Harvard faculty, you've got white men who are not voting the way white men do. You've got white women who are not voting the way white women typically do. And it's all fine. They should arrive at their own ideas. They shouldn't feel they have to. But somehow the outcome of that is you don't have a faculty that reflects the great range of experiences that people actually have across the spectrum. It reminded me a bit when I was in law school in Chicago in 1977. They said, well, you know, we just hired the best person. We don't have any women on the faculty, but we just hired the best person. Well, some of us thought, you know, that's got to end. And some of my friends filed an EEOC complaint, and all of a sudden they were able to find some good women to bring in.
Can I just say one thing about that? I think it's a really important point that the university doesn't necessarily have to do everything, or any one particular part of the university doesn't necessarily have to do everything. I go back to Dick Fallon's point that he made during his panel about how the thing just keeps going in the direction of getting people who are more and more just straight graduate school model legal academics, rather than people who are training, who might be more adept to train people to actually be lawyers. We can't be everything to everyone. And again, I think liberal education is a wonderful thing, but you have to have 4 years of liberal education before you even get to law school. And I just worry about the extent to which we're just being self-indulgent in saying, let's run a graduate school filled with people who didn't actually choose to go to graduate school for the most part, unless they're going to Yale. But otherwise, they went to law school because they want to be lawyers, right? And I think that raises questions about fundamental economic justice and affordability that we really can't afford to ignore.
Professor Campos, can I ask a question? Sure. Some people have argued recently, including my dean, Dan Rodriguez, that perhaps law school should be a 2-year process rather than a 3-year process. Do you have an opinion on that question? Or?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that what we ought to have is a relatively deregulated profession in which there ought to be a lot more room for experimentation. So, for example, it might be perfectly possible to produce people who are well trained to practice law along the model that just about the rest of the world uses, in which you get an undergraduate degree with an emphasis in legal studies and then have some sort of apprenticeship model. So I'd be willing to go a lot further than saying, let's just get rid of the 3rd year of law school, which is something that that we didn't used to have anyways until the ALS basically decided that it would be in the interest of law schools to force everybody to have a 3-year program. So I agree certainly with Dean Rodriguez that we at the very least ought to take one step in that direction, because I'm concerned that what we now have is a really very self-indulgent model that works really well for Harvard Law School professors, works moderately well for Harvard Law students, and doesn't really work for just about anybody else other than the law professors everywhere else.
Well, just to follow up on this, Shakespeare, of course, famously said the first thing we have to do is kill all the lawyers. The French revolutionaries and Lenin and the communists also started out very opposed to law. Is there is there some argument to be made that training people to respect procedure and process and training lawyers in the way we're doing, in fact, stabilizes society? And how would you comment on those episodes?
Well, I mean, certainly there's there's a great deal to be said for the legitimation function of law schools. I don't quarrel with that, but the legitimation of function of law schools was working just great when Harvard Law School cost $5,000 a year in $2012. You know, it's we can get the virtues of the rule of law without leaving people with $150,000 of non-dischargeable educational debt, usually from institutions that do not produce results anything like those available to graduates of the Harvard Law School.
Joel?
I thought that the discussion in this panel brought forward a possible solution that could address some of the issues that were raised in the second panel. So one concern that was echoed a lot in the second panel was, is this going to lead to quotas for a particular political group? Is that what we're proposing here? Do we need to have lists of Democratic and Republican affiliations of faculty? What exactly is the proposal? I thought the proposal that was implicit in what Professors Suk and George were saying was, well, no, it's not about Republican or Democrat. It's not even necessarily about conservative, liberal in a political sense, although that's the shorthand that we've been using just for convenience. It really is more, what are the pressing legal topics of the day, or that will be pressing in the next few years, and where do we have gaps in our faculty in terms of representations of different views? Not to pigeonhole people, but just because there are some scholars who are very prominent on certain issues. So we might say, look, this particular legal topic, the Commerce Clause, for example. Now, Commerce Clause is going to be a huge deal going forward after NFIB versus Sebelius in all likelihood. Well, we don't have a whole lot of people on the faculty who are in public law who are advocating for a narrower view of the Commerce Clause. Wouldn't it be good to have someone on that who fills that role, given that that's going to be a major topic of conversation? So I was just wondering if that might be a way to get out of this trap that seems like a lot of the last panel was concerned with, that we might just end up to get away from political labels and get more towards substantive views.
Any panelists want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with this, obviously. I mean, I don't think you can get, that it would make sense to get too narrow to topics that are too specific. Topics come and go and so forth. But, if you got a NOSIC, if you got a Rawls around, it'd be a great thing to have a NOSIC around. If you've got a Peter Singer around, it'd be a great thing to have, somebody, a John Haldane around. Making sure that there are people who are going to be challenging other people's premises all the way down, so that the discussions are as serious as they can possibly be, and defeating the general atmosphere that's going to, that could, in the worst situation, also pervade the student body, of a kind of stifling orthodoxy, of a kind of groupthink. It does wonders for students when they hear faculty members argue points fundamentally all the way down to the premises, because they genuinely and sincerely disagree with each other, but are willing to engage each other in an atmosphere of mutual respect, whether that's in a classroom team teaching situation, or just you can go to this guy's class, you go to that guy's class.
So, one of the original justifications for racial affirmative action was as a prophylaxis for the discrimination in places like firefighter hiring that would take place and would continue taking place if there weren't some numerical antidote to it. Could a case be made that the law schools are at a point where they can use a dose of that?
I don't think there's a need for any quotas. I think there's a lot of the earlier discussion indicated that there are excellent scholars out there, conservative and libertarian scholars, who haven't been hired at the kinds of law schools where they ought to be. So I think it's just a matter of getting a fair evaluation of these people. I think that would be quite sufficient.
I'd like to comment just briefly. There was some talk during the last panel about whether moderates are represented on faculties, and that caused me to think that the reward system for young faculty members is not particularly to write articles that advocate balancing tests or moderation. Instead, you get noticed by staking out a position or making a claim. And unfortunately for younger conservative and libertarian academics, the position they stake out or the claim that they may make may be one that liberal faculty at other schools really strongly disagree with. We've seen recently the end of the period of time in our history, I think, when law professors could be appointed appellate judges or Supreme Court justices, or it's certainly much more difficult. Part of the reason why is that an academic produces a paper trail. That's what an academic is supposed to do, but that is something that is very harmful in terms of confirmation processes. Anyone have thoughts on any of that? Other questions? Yes.
One of the main justifications against the affirmative action policies.
Can you speak louder?
Hold it down. Okay. Yeah. One of the justifications against affirmative action policies tends to be that we want to encourage some sort of meritocracy. And so if, for example, in the law school setting, then African Americans have difficulty achieving the same grades and test scores, we might want to encourage some way to bridge that gap, but we don't want to also bring them in if they're not at the same level. I don't know if it was necessarily addressed in this context for conservatives, but I think all statistical studies have shown that there are definitely, at least in schools like Harvard and Yale, much more liberal students and probably much more liberal aspiring academics. And I just wonder if that needs to be addressed or acknowledged, that maybe it isn't always a problem of bias in the hiring practices, but also just simply, for whatever reason, liberals tend to end up in these places. Maybe 70% of them end up going after these jobs, and so you'll see 70% of them getting these jobs, regardless of any sort of bias that exists.
Yeah. There are always these, you run into these embarrassing claims sometimes that, well, the reason that things are so lopsided ideologically at Princeton or wherever it is that liberals are just smarter than conservatives. And I've actually heard that said in a faculty meeting, and to the credit of the faculty, who are overwhelmingly liberal, they just laughed. I mean, they know that's not the right explanation. Sometimes it's said, it's a little less embarrassing, that it's because conservatives are really interested in making money, and liberals are really interested in ideas. And therefore, liberals apply and conservatives go use their law degrees to work at Cravath, Swaine, and more, if they happen to have the advantage of having gone to one of these 8 or 10 most prestigious law schools. But I don't think you can explain the thing away. I mean, there is a problem. As I say, it has less to do with conscious bias, although that's there, than it does with this non-conscious bias. And with the result, in very many places, that you create an atmosphere in which it seems hostile for conservatives, and you're worried that you're not going to get a fair shake, even if you try to make it as an academic, either because of you'll be unsuccessful in the process in the first place, or you'll be successful, but then you're going to be living in dread fear of not getting tenure. Or for some other reason, you'll be denied unfairly an opportunity to have a successful academic career. So, somehow we have to break that thing, that cycle.
But you just
Final
wouldn't
question?
concede the point that there aren't more liberals than conservatives in a school like Harvard, for example, because I think there certainly are.
Yeah, there certainly are. I mean, it's certainly true I think it's true at Harvard. I mean, I can tell you for sure it's true at Princeton.
Final question?
Yes, Professor George. You're teaching here at Harvard, yes?
Yeah.
You've been enormously successful. I mean, I'm amused at the affirmative action quota discussion. I find that fascinating, right? Well, the blacks, come on, special pleading, right? Then the conservatives, at certain points I heard something that sort of felt like quotas for conservatives, which is, you have to think about it, right? In the affirmative action, that's sort of hilarious that you have conservatives who are on the losing end of something, invoking what smells like affirmative action when it's another group, well, oh my God. And so now, when it's the blacks, well, they're just not up to snuff, right? Which is fine. That's okay. I'll accept that. All right, I'll accept that blacks just couldn't handle it, they couldn't cut it, and so they're not represented in numbers as they'd like. Now, I'm perfectly willing then to take that same argument and apply it in this case, where maybe what applied to blacks might apply to conservatives. Now, what's interesting to me is that Professor George is here at Harvard, right? And he is enormously successful. I mean, he's virtually a rock star up here. I mean, he's got a following.
That's certainly not true. But anyway.
Well, that's the impression I have. So maybe, probably I missed it, but was I hearing the invocation of the principle of affirmative action, which is not applied to one group, being appealed to for another?
No, well, I wasn't advocating, and I don't think anybody else was on this or the previous panel. I mean, I think the message is, stop the conscious discrimination. Come down like a ton of bricks on that. Embarrass people who engage in it. Try to get people to think really self-critically as they're evaluating other people's work, so that they'll be able to actually understand, perceive the quality of work that challenges their most fundamental beliefs, and take other steps to avoid creating this stifling atmosphere of groupthink or orthodoxy. That's all that was being claimed. Now, sometimes I run into this sometimes. Sorry again for the personal narrative, violating the rule again, where people will say, "Ha, George, you have no right to make an argument that the academic world excludes conservatives. You're an out-of-the-closet radical right-wing nut, and you've had this successful academic career. You're teaching at Princeton, and this year you're teaching at Harvard. You are the evidence of the falsity of what you're claiming." But that's obviously fallacious. Yeah.
I did not understand other speakers to be arguing for affirmative action for conservatives, but rather to be arguing against groupthink. Yes. Go ahead.
I'm actually interested to see if any of the panelists feel that maybe one potential solution is to have multiple professors teaching one course. I know that as a student, I find it frustrating that I have to think about, well, am I going to be taught at? And is this professor going to be a liberal or conservative or a libertarian in the closet or whatever, what you have it? And I'm interested in the more kind of controversial topics, if maybe a potential solution at a school like Harvard would be to have 3 professors alternate weeks.
Cool. Could I respond? I mean, look, that's a great idea if there's no scarcity, right? I mean, that's the problem. There's all kinds of great ideas. I mean, this course, I want to take that course too. I want to take the course with Professor George and Cornell West. Sounds great, but also I would like to play pickup basketball with LeBron James and Kobe Bryant. That would be fun too, right? But the problem is it's too expensive, right? And I'm not trying to be facetious here, but because it's really kind of a dark topic. There are many, many things that would be wonderful to do in the context of legal education that we just we just can't do because it's unreasonable in terms of the current economic structure of the American legal profession. And so I think we just have to make some very hard decisions about, like, how can we nurture the things we want to nurture at a reasonable price? And the answers to that are going to vary tremendously depending upon the institutional context.
I just want to say that, yes, that sounds like a wonderful pedagogical situation. However, I want to resist the idea that somehow that would be the ideal way for students to somehow be initiated into a subject matter or into a discrete legal topic. You have to understand the limitations of your teachers. That's part of the learning process, that the teacher doesn't represent every bit of the spectrum, and that is also part of the pedagogy. And I think that to have somehow this ideal that in every course, what the ideal teacher would do would be actually to be Cornell West and Robbie George all wrapped up into one. That's not what it is. Or that the ideal thing would be actually to have them both in the room. You know, some students are lucky enough to do that, some aren't. But I would also want to resist the idea that that would be what you would get if we really had all the resources in the world. Actually, there's something really valuable about getting one professor doing his or her best to expose the students, to really make them think, to allow them to have the experience of saying certain arguments and seeing its limitations, seeing the teacher's own limitations in terms of the viewpoints that they might be able to express. So that's what I would say.
I think that's a very fitting note to end on, and we should thank the panel for a wonderful discussion. Thanks as well to the Harvard Federalist chapter for a very good conference.